My apologies, firstly, for not being with you today in New Delhi, and secondly, my gratitude to the organizers for this highlighting this really important topic of genocide in Sri Lanka. I will talk to you today about three things. Primarily about the model for genocide that has been developed by my organization, TAG, Tamils Against Genocide, which is based in the US. Secondly, about the events of 2009, and I shall compare them to Srebrenica as a case study, and to the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia, the ICTY's judgment in Srebrenica and its relevance to the events in the Bani in 2009. And thirdly, I shall very briefly comment on the Indian state's responsibility in this area. But firstly, the model, the long-term model that TAG has taken. In February 2009, TAG submitted a report, a model indictment to the US Justice Department. The indictment was against Gotabaya Rajapakse and General Fonseca, the commander at the time. And effectively, the indictment at that point in time, in February 2009, was based on a structural long-term case for genocide. So I'm going to talk about that. The way that I look at the issues, we have literally multiple definitions. We have the UN Genocide Convention, which defines genocide as any one of a number of acts, including killing, physical harm, any one of a number of acts that are committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic group or a national group, and as well as other groups such as religious groups. The types of acts that the UN Convention looks at, for example, would be not just death and serious bodily and mental harm, but also deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So that would be, for example, starvation. If you have an embargo on food and medicine, as happened in the Vani, that would count under Part 3, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of that group. So we could look in terms of what is a group. We could look, firstly, we could of course look at Tamils as a whole in Sri Lanka, and in the 60-year case, in the structural long-term case, we would say that is the group, that is the target group. But for 2009, the events of 2009, we would say that the target group is the Tamil population of the Vani. Very similar to Srebrenica, where the target group was not all Muslims in Bosnia, but those in that particular location in Srebrenica itself. So we can look at this in multiple ways. But before we go to the UN Convention, much more intuitive is the definition of genocide that was coined by Raphael Lemkin. Now, Lemkin is the man who invented the word genocide. He's the founding father of genocide studies. And let me just look at, I love his definition. It's most intuitive that I can find. And let me look at what he said. Now, what Lemkin said is that, generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation. Right? It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aimed at the destruction of the essential foundations of life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. Okay? So the objectives of such a plan, says Lemkin, would be the disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, economic existence, and the destruction also of personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and ultimately the lives of the individuals concerned. So it was a much broader definition and doesn't require specifically, mass killing all at once. It's not necessarily the Holocaust, it's not necessarily Rwanda. The original definition is much broader, and we relied on this definition. So with respect to Sri Lanka, what kind of actions, what kind of instances would we cite? We would, for example, look differently than at the killing of the aid workers, at Sri Lanka's history of destroying aid workers. So, for example, the killing of the TRO9 aid workers and the 17 ACF, the Action contre la Femme aid workers in Trincomalee. When we look at that, we would say that the motive for killing aid workers must be that there is no proper motive for killing aid workers. They're not political, that there's really no proper motive. But one motive would be to destroy the aid distribution network. i.e. to make it very difficult for NGOs, aid workers to operate. But of course, aid workers serve the most vulnerable population. They serve, they serve the displaced people. Right? So the purpose of killing aid workers is to destroy the supplies, the network that helps the displaced people to survive. So for us, the destruction of that network, okay, which makes the displaced people already more vulnerable. They don't. ACF was distributing food to internally displaced people. The destruction of that network is an act of genocide. So also would we view differently the killing of press workers and media workers. So we look at Sri Lanka differently, for example, from how RSF, the Reporters Sans Frontières, see it merely as a press freedom issue. But we look at it as slightly differently. We look at it as destroying the means of communication of a community. Because when we look at the issue, we notice that, yes, there are about 34 journalists were killed between 2004 and 2009. Sorry, I didn't mean journalists, I meant press workers, and I will go to the distinction later. But 29 of them were Tamil. And Tamils, of course, are a fraction of the population. So the real impact, if you break down the numbers by ethnicity, you come to the real impact of that. But we would look more importantly at another aspect of this, which is simply that, for example, the non-Tamils, for example, Lasantha Vikramatunga, you can identify what the motives behind their assassinations. They were political, they were issues of what they said. But in the Tamil case, we would look, for example, at the fact that distribution workers, newspaper delivery boys were being targeted. And we would say that's not because the newspaper delivery boys had a particular opinion or their newspaper had a particular opinion, because all Tamil newspapers were targeted, not because of a particular editorial line or a particular corruption story they were running at the time, but it was a long-running issue, and it was not the journalists themselves, the content creators, but the distribution network. So that it would be an attack on the communication lines. Community, this goes to the foundations of life in modern life. The community cannot function if it cannot communicate. So we would look at those two aspects, for example, quite differently. But I would go, if I step back a bit, I would look at all of the things that have happened in Sri Lanka in this context. I would say, what are the timelines and methods of genocide? Okay, and so looking at Lemkin's work, I would start with legislation. I would say that the Citizenship Law of 1948 is a form of the Language Act. I would look at nonviolent ethnic cleansing, any kind of economic acts that would encourage the Tamils to move out of Sri Lanka, to emigrate. I would look at pogroms. We had a series, 1956, 77, 83 was the biggest. I would look